What if Genesis wasn't the first creation story, but the last? What if every ancient civilization, from the plains of Mesopotamia to the temples of Egypt, had already described the same pattern centuries before the Bible was written? Before Yahweh said, "Let there be light," others had already spoken those words. Before the firmament divided the waters, the separation had already been described. But here's what makes this fascinating. These older myths preserved a distinction that Genesis would later collapse. In our last video, we showed that Yahweh fits the pattern of the demiurge, the organizing principle, rather than the ultimate source. So tonight we're going deeper, tracing the pattern backward, through Canaan, Babylon, and Egypt, all the way to Sumer, to find what Genesis inherited and what it changed. Because that pattern didn't start with the Bible, it was everywhere, thousands of years before Genesis was compiled. And when the Hebrew scribes finally wrote their creation account, they weren't inventing cosmology from scratch. They were borrowing. So let me know where you're watching from, and let's trace Genesis back to its origins. First, let's address something that needs to be said clearly from the start. Many people assume that the ancient myths we're about to explore copied their stories from the Bible, that Genesis came first. This is factually incorrect, and the evidence proving it wrong is overwhelming. The Hebrew language, as recorded in the earliest biblical texts, dates back perhaps to the 10th century BCE at the earliest. Most scholars place the compilation of Genesis during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. The Mesopotamian myths, etched onto clay tablets in cuneiform script, are over 1,000 years older. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic we'll examine, was composed around 1200 BCE, possibly earlier. The Sumerian myths we'll explore were being written down as early as 3000 BCE. This is archaeological fact, confirmed by carbon dating and linguistic analysis. And here's where it gets undeniable. The Hebrew Bible's creation story contains Akkadian cognates, words borrowed from that much earlier language, not the other way around. The direction of borrowing is clear, and biblical scholars have known this for over a century. Professor Joseph Blenkinsop writes, "Scholars agree that most of the primeval history borrows directly or indirectly from Mesopotamian mythology, and Genesis 1 is no exception. The consensus is clear. Genesis almost certainly owes its existence to these earlier creation accounts. Why? Because they were working within an ancient Near Eastern cosmological tradition. They adapted it, they monotheized it, they reframed it for Israelite theology, but they didn't invent it. So as we walk through these creation myths, understand, we're not looking at stories that copied Genesis. We're looking at the stories Genesis copied from, and once you see the parallels, linguistic, structural, thematic, you can't unsee it. Let's start where writing began, in Sumer. Close your eyes and imagine you're standing in ancient Ur, around 2500 BCE. The ziggurat rises above you, its mud brick steps climbing toward the heavens. Priests chant in a language that will be dead for 3,000 years by the time Christ is born. And in the temple school, scribes are pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, recording the stories their ancestors had been telling since before writing existed. Stories about how the world came to be, not through magic, through engineering. The Sumerians were the world's first urban civilization. They built the first cities, invented the first writing system, created the first law codes, and their cosmology reflected their pragmatic worldview. Creation was work, divine work, but work nonetheless. So what does the cosmic architecture look like? Before gods, before heaven and earth existed as separate things, there was only Namu, the primordial sea, boundless and eternal. From Namu emerged Anki, not two things, but one thing, a cosmic mountain where An, heaven, and Kai, earth, were fused together, inseparable. Imagine it, the universe as a single massive structure, sky and ground pressed against each other with no space in between, no room for life, no air, no realm for gods or humans to exist. This needed to be fixed, and the one who fixed it was Enlil, the god of wind, of air, of the space in between. Enlil didn't create heaven and earth. They already existed as Anki. What he did was separate them. He pushed. With the force of wind, with divine strength, he drove a wedge between sky and ground, and rose upward to become the dome of heaven. Ki was pressed downward to become the foundation of earth, and in the space between them, Enlil created Lil, air, wind, breath. the medium in which life could exist. This is pure organizing function. The gods who came after this separation faced a problem. The world now existed, earth below, heaven above, air in between, but it was wild, untamed. The rivers flooded chaotically, the land was marshy and difficult, and the gods were tired of maintaining it. So the Anunnaki, the divine council, the assembly of great gods, held a meeting. Now, we need to pause here. If you've heard the name Anunnaki before, it's probably from modern theories about ancient astronauts, alien beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth to mine gold and genetically engineered humans to do the work. That interpretation comes from Zecharia Sitchin's 1976 book, The 12th Planet, not from ancient Sumerian tablets. In the actual cuneiform texts, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis, the myths recorded 4,000 years ago, the Anunnaki aren't aliens, they're gods, the divine council. The word literally means those of royal blood or offspring of An, the sky god. The council was led by three great powers, An, heaven, Enlil, wind/earth, and Enki, water/wisdom. And they had a labor problem. The younger gods, the Igigi, had been assigned to dig the great canals, to maintain the irrigation systems that made civilization possible in Mesopotamia. But the Igigi rebelled. They threw down their tools and refused to work. The text is vivid. The gods were digging canals, the Igigi were dredging rivers. For 3,600 years they bore the excess. Hard work, night and day. They groaned and blamed each other. So the Anunnaki, faced with rebellion, came up with a solution. Create a new being. One designed specifically to do the labor the gods no longer wanted to do. Enki, the clever one, the engineer god, designed the process. Take clay from the earth, mix it with divine blood from a sacrificed god, and shape it into human form. And that's how humanity entered the Sumerian cosmology. Not as exalted image bearers, not as children of God in the later theological sense. As a workforce, a solution to a divine labor shortage. The Atrahasis epic is explicit. Let him bear the yoke. Let him carry the work basket of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of God. Humans were created from clay and divine essence to maintain the cosmos, to dig the canals, tend the fields, offer sacrifices that fed the gods. Now, there's one more element of the Sumerian tradition we need to cover: the flood. In the Eridu Genesis, humanity multiplies and becomes numerous, and the noise, the sheer volume of human activity, disturbs the gods. Enlil, king of the gods, decides to solve the problem by destroying humanity through a great flood. But Enki, who designed humans, doesn't want his creation destroyed. So he warns a man named Ziusudra, a righteous king, to build a boat, to gather animals, to survive the coming catastrophe. The flood comes, and humanity is nearly wiped out, but Ziusudra survives. When the waters recede, the gods regret what they've done, and they grant Ziusudra eternal life. This is the prototype for Noah. Ziusudra becomes Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian version, then Noah in Hebrew tradition. But the Sumerian version came first. Written down around 1600 BCE, likely based on oral traditions going back centuries earlier. Here's the Genesis connection. Biblical scholar David Carr notes that Genesis 1:6, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water," describes the exact same cosmological structure as Enlil's separation of Anki. Heaven pushed above, earth pressed below, and a vault creating space in between. The Hebrew word for this vault, rakia, means a beaten-out dome, hammered thin like metal, just like Enlil's forceful separation of sky from ground. And Genesis 2:7, "The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, clay shaped into human form, divine essence breathed into matter." The same pattern as Enki's creation, just reframed with one god instead of a council. Professor John Collins writes, "In the Atrahasis story, humanity was created to do agricultural work for the gods. In Genesis, the first human being is also charged with keeping the garden of God. The material is identical, only the theological framing changed. Sumer gave us the template. Pre-existing waters, divine engineers, separation of fused elements, humans created from earth and divine breath. Genesis would inherit all of it. But while Sumer gave us the engineers, Egypt would give us something different. Not physical force, but conceptual power. not separation through strength, but creation through language, the Logos. Picture the Nile Delta, around 2400 BCE. The Old Kingdom is at its height. The pyramids are being built, and in the darkness of those pyramids, priests are carving texts into stone, texts that would be read by firelight for the next 1,000 years. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in human history, and they tell a different story than Sumer. Not engineers digging canals, but consciousness emerging from infinite depth. Not physical labor, but intellectual creation. The Egyptians began where Sumer began, with eternal waters. They called it Nu, or Nun, the boundless, dark, silent abyss that existed before existence. The texts describe it as infinite potential, neither light nor dark, neither being nor non-being, just endless watery depth. And from this abyss, something emerged. A mound, the Benben. The primordial hillock rising from the infinite ocean, like the first land appearing after the Nile's annual flood recedes. And on that mound stood Adam. The name means the complete one, or the all, sometimes called Adam Ra when merged with the sun god. But here's what's crucial. Adam is described as self-created, not from nothing, but because he differentiated himself from the waters. He was the first point of consciousness emerging from undifferentiated potential, the first I arising from infinite is. And what Adam did next established a pattern Genesis would inherit. He created through thought and word. The theology is sophisticated, more sophisticated than you might expect from texts carved 4,400 years ago. Atum conceived creation in his heart, not his emotional heart, but the Egyptian concept of the heart as the seat of thought, intention, will. And then he spoke it into being. His tongue became the instrument of manifestation. Thought became word became reality. This is the origin of the Logos, the principle that consciousness and language can bring structure to formless being. But the Egyptian tradition went further. In Memphis, the ancient capital, priests developed what scholars call the Memphite theology. And at its center was Ptah, the craftsman, the divine architect. Ptah didn't wield hammers or chisels in the physical sense. His craft was conceptual. The text from the Shabaka stone, dating to around 710 BCE but recording much older traditions, describes it this way. There came into being in the heart, thought. There came into being on the tongue, word, in the form of Adam. Ptah is the very great, who gave life to all the gods through his heart and tongue. Notice the structure. First, conception in the heart, pure thought, the blueprint forming in divine consciousness. Second, speaking with the tongue, the word carrying the thought out of internal consciousness into external reality. Third, manifestation. The thought-made word becomes matter, form, and structured cosmos. When the eyes see, the ears hear, the nose breathes, they report to the heart. It is the heart that brings forth every understanding, and the tongue that repeats what the heart has thought. This is creation as intellectual and linguistic act, not building with hands or separating with force, but conceiving with mind and speaking with voice. The Egyptians were careful about something Genesis would later obscure, the distinction between the waters and the one who organizes them. Nu, the primordial abyss, is eternal, infinite, pre-existing Adam, predating even Ptah's conceptual craftsmanship. The gods emerge from it, organize it, and impose structure onto it, but they don't create it. Let's trace the process in the Heliopolitan tradition, the theology of Heliopolis, the city of the sun. First, Nu, the waters, eternal and undifferentiated. Second, Adam emerges, self-created through differentiation from the waters. Third, Adam creates through a process of division. He brings forth Shu, air, and Tefnut, moisture. Fourth, Shu and Tefnut give birth to Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, who are initially locked in perpetual embrace until Shu separates them, lifting Nut above as the vault of heaven. The same pattern as Sumer. Heaven and earth must be separated. They don't naturally exist as distinct realms. They're fused and must be divided, and once divided, the space between them becomes the realm where life can exist. Then comes the final stage, ordering the parts. The Ennead, the 9 gods of Heliopolis, each govern a specific domain: air, moisture, earth, sky, life, death, chaos, order, and justice. Not ruling from outside reality, but functioning as principles within it. Each god is a particular organizing force, maintaining a particular aspect of structured cosmos. This is divine governance, not as personal whim, but as systematic administration. The Genesis connection? Professor Joseph Blenkinsop writes, Genesis 1 belongs to the genre of cosmogony narratives about world origins, and ancient cosmogonic myths in that culture area begin by describing the way it was at the time of first creation. Genesis follows this exact Egyptian pattern. Genesis 1:2 describes the pre-creation state. The earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Just like Egyptian Nu, the eternal abyss present before organization begins. Then comes the linguistic creation. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God said, "Let there be a vault." And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered." 10 times in Genesis 1, the phrase appears, "And God said." This isn't original Hebrew innovation, it is Egyptian theology, translated. The Memphite theology predates Genesis by at least a millennium, and the pattern is identical. Divine consciousness conceives structure, divine voice speaks it, reality conforms. Tah's heart and tongue become Yahweh's word. The Egyptians gave the ancient world something Sumer hadn't fully articulated: creation as linguistic event, not physical engineering, but conceptual architecture. Reality as the product of divine speech operating on eternal substrate. And Genesis would inherit this completely. But between Egypt and Genesis, there was Babylon. And Babylon would add something neither Sumer nor Egypt emphasized: creation through violence. Not engineering, not speech, but conquest. Imagine Babylon at its height, around 1200 BCE, perhaps earlier. The walls rise 90 feet high. The Ishtar Gate gleams with glazed blue tiles. The hanging gardens cascade with greenery. And in the Temple of Marduk, priests recite the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, every year during the New Year festival. 7 tablets, nearly 1,000 lines, the most detailed creation myth the ancient world would produce. And it opens with the line that would echo forward for 3,000 years. When on high no name was given to heaven, nor below was the netherworld called by name. Before names, before distinction, before anything existed as a separate, defined thing, what was there? Primordial Apsu was their progenitor, and Matrix Tiamat was she who bore them all. Their waters were mingled together. 2 oceans, Apsu, the freshwater abyss beneath the earth, the underground ocean from which all springs and rivers flow. Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, bitter and vast, surrounding the world. Not god and goddess in the sense of persons yet, more like principles, forces, the masculine and feminine aspects of primordial water. So these 2 oceans mingled, their waters mixed, and from their mingling, the first gods were born, the twins, Lamu and Lahamu. Generation after generation, more gods emerged, each more complex, more active, more individuated than the one before. And they were noisy. The text is specific about this. The young gods disturbed Apsu's rest. Their commotion shattered the primordial silence. Apsu complained to Tiamat, "Their behavior disturbs me. By day I have no rest. By night I cannot sleep. I will destroy them." Tiamat, as mother, tried to dissuade him, but Apsu was determined. So the gods learned of the plan, and Ea, called Enki in Sumerian tradition, the god of wisdom and water, acted first. He cast a spell over Apsu, put him into deep sleep, and killed him. The freshwater abyss was slain, and in its place, Ea established his dwelling. This is already remarkable, the killing of a primordial principle to create space for divine habitation. But it gets more dramatic. Tiamat, enraged by the murder of her consort, prepared for war. She created monsters, serpents with venom for blood, dragons, storm demons, all the forces of chaos she could command. And she made Kingu, one of her offspring, the general of her army, giving him the Tablet of Destinies. The gods were terrified. None of them could stand against Tiamat's fury, until Marduk stepped forward. Marduk, son of Ea, god of storms and wind, young and ambitious. He made an offer: "I will fight Tiamat. I will defeat her and save you all. But in return, you must make me king of the gods." The divine council agreed. They elevated Marduk to supreme authority through a formal assembly, granting him powers none of the other gods possessed. And then comes the battle. Marduk armed himself with winds, 7 winds in total, each a weapon. He made a net to catch Tiamat. He crafted a lightning spear. He mounted his storm chariot and rode to meet her. The text describes the confrontation in vivid detail. When Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow him, he drove the winds inside her. They inflated her from within, and she couldn't close her jaws. Marduk drove his spear through her open mouth, piercing her heart, and killed the primordial ocean. But then, and this is crucial, he didn't let her corpse vanish or dissolve. He split Tiamat's body in half like a shellfish. With one half, he created the sky, stretching her skin above as the vault of heaven, establishing bolts and guards to prevent her waters from escaping. With the other half, he formed the foundation of the earth, creating the mountains and continents. Her eyes became the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, her tears became the clouds, and her tail became the Milky Way. Every part of her body was repurposed, transformed from chaos into structured cosmos. And then Marduk set about administration. He established the stars as stations, fixed points that would govern the calendar, marking seasons, months, days. He assigned gods to their various duties, who would govern the sun, the moon, the storms, the harvests. He created order, hierarchy, system, and finally, he created humans, not from clay and divine essence like in Sumer, but from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general, the leader of her rebel army. Kingu was sacrificed. His blood was mixed with earth, and from this mixture, Ea shaped humanity. The purpose? Same as in Sumer: to serve the gods, maintain the temples, and perform the rituals that keep the cosmos running. But the method is darker. Humans are made from the blood of a defeated rebel. There's a hint of punishment baked into the creation, as if humanity inherits the guilt of the chaos army it descended from. After his victory, Marduk establishes 50 names for himself. He becomes the supreme administrator, not because he created the universe from nothing, but because he organized the chaos and now maintains the order. The text established the divinely ordained dominance of the Babylonian city-state. Thus, by elevating Marduk, the epic elevates Babylon. Now this is where the linguistic evidence for the Genesis connection becomes undeniable. The Hebrew word for the deep in Genesis 1:2 is Tehom, and Tehom and Tiamat are linguistically related. They share a common Semitic root. Professors Ludwig Kohler and Walter Baumgartner explain that both Hebrew Tehom and Akkadian Tiamat derive from the general Semitic Tahom. When Genesis describes darkness over the surface of Tehom, it's invoking the same primordial reality Babylon called Tiamat. But Genesis has removed the personality and stripped away the mythology. Tiamat isn't a dragon anymore. She's just the deep, passive, impersonal, waiting to be organized. There's no battle in Genesis, no violence, or corpse being split and repurposed. Just waters already present, and God's Spirit hovering over them, about to speak structure into existence. Scholars call this demythologization, removing the mythological narrative while keeping the cosmological structure. Professor Frank Lothar Hosfeld notes that other biblical texts preserve traces of the combat myth. Genesis inherited Babylon's framework, pre-existing waters, a god who organizes them, structured cosmos resulting. But it made the process peaceful, made it linguistic rather than violent. Let there be replaces I will destroy and rebuild. Divine word replaces divine warfare, and the world as we know it is the result of organization, not origination. Now, before Genesis, there was one more layer, a local template, a tradition the Israelites would have known intimately because they lived within it: Canaan. And now we need to talk about something that makes many people uncomfortable. The religion described in the Hebrew Bible, the worship of Yahweh as the one true God, didn't emerge in a vacuum. It developed from within Canaanite culture. The early Israelites weren't foreign invaders who brought a completely new religion. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests they were Canaanites who gradually differentiated themselves, developing a distinct identity over centuries. And the God they worshipped, Yahweh, shows clear characteristics of Canaanite divine typology. This matters because Canaan, the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia, the crossroads of ancient Near Eastern culture, had its own rich mythological tradition. And that tradition provides the most direct ancestor to biblical cosmology. The primary source we have is the Ugaritic texts, tablets discovered in 1929 at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, dating to around 1400 to 1200 BCE. These texts describe a pantheon headed by El and an active storm god named Baal-Hadad, and the parallels to later Hebrew religion are striking. Let's start with El. El is the father of the gods, the ancient one, the king, the creator of creatures. but he's also distant and removed from day-to-day affairs. He dwells at the source of the two rivers, at the edge of the cosmos, in a cosmic temple. He's benevolent but inactive. He's the ultimate authority, but he doesn't govern directly. When the gods have disputes, they come to El for judgment. When they need permission for major actions, they seek El's blessing. But El doesn't fight battles or manage the world. He presides, but doesn't rule in the active sense. This is the source figure, the ultimate but transcendent deity. And then there's Baal. Baal Hadad, the storm god, the rider of clouds, the one who brings rain and fertility. Baal is active, engaged, fighting constantly to maintain cosmic order. And his primary antagonist is Yam, Prince Yam, the personification of the sea, chaos in watery form. The Baal cycle describes an epic battle. Yam demands that Baal be surrendered to him. He claims supremacy and threatens to overthrow the divine order. Baal refuses. With weapons crafted by the divine craftsman Kothar Wakasis, Baal fights Yam. He defeats the sea and establishes his sovereignty over the waters. And after his victory, Baal builds his house, his palace, his temple, the cosmic structure from which he governs. But the text is careful. Baal doesn't destroy Yam completely. He subdues him, limits him, and keeps him bound. Because the sea must exist, but also be controlled. This is pure organizing function, not destroying chaos, but managing it. Not eliminating the waters, but imposing limits on them. And there's another enemy, Mot, the personification of death. Baal battles Mot in a seasonal cycle. In one part of the year, Mot kills Baal, drags him down to the underworld. But Baal returns. He's resurrected and reclaims his throne. This is the agricultural cycle of the ancient Near East, the dry season when everything dies, and the wet season when life returns. But mythologically, it's Baal's constant struggle to maintain order against the forces that would return reality to chaos. Now, here's what's crucial for understanding Genesis. The Canaanite tradition has El, transcendent father figure, source, and Baal, active warrior god, organizer, as separate deities. One presides, the other acts. One is ultimate, the other is functional. But when Israelite religion developed, something happened. Yahweh absorbed both roles. Early in Israelite history, Yahweh may have been understood as a warrior god similar to Baal, dwelling on mountains, riding clouds, bringing storms. But over time, especially after the Babylonian exile, Yahweh was elevated to absorb El's role as well. He became both the transcendent father and the active warrior, both the ultimate source and the governing power. The two categories collapsed into one God. And that's why Hebrew poetry preserves echoes of the old mythological battles that Genesis would later sanitize. Psalm 74, 13-14. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Psalm 89, 9-10. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. Job 26, 12-13. By his power he stilled the sea. By his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his wind the heavens were made fair. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. These aren't metaphors. They're remnants of the older mythology. Leviathan, the multi-headed sea serpent called Lutan in Ugaritic texts, the creature Baal fought. Rahab, another name for the chaos monster of the sea. The fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent that represented untamed waters. The battle with the sea wasn't just symbolic. It was the cosmological pattern, the divine warrior defeating chaos to establish order. But Genesis removed the battle. In Genesis 1, there's no fight. Yahweh doesn't battle Tehom. He doesn't defeat a sea monster and use its corpse to build the world. He simply speaks, "Let there be," and the waters obey. Why? Because by the time Genesis was written, Israelite theology was moving toward monotheism. And in strict monotheism, God can't have real enemies. There can't be other gods. If Yahweh fought a sea dragon and won, that implies the dragon was a rival power, a second force that had to be defeated. But if Yahweh is the only God, then chaos can't be personified as a rival deity. So the texts preserve the structure while removing the mythological narrative. Biblical scholar Mark Smith writes that early Israelite religion emerged from Canaanite culture, and Yahweh's characteristics show clear development from storm god typology, like Baal Hadad. The cloud-riding, mountain-dwelling, storm-bringing deity of early Hebrew poetry reflects this heritage. Genesis didn't invent its cosmology. It inherited the Canaanite template of pre-existing waters and divine organization, the Egyptian template of creation through divine speech, the Sumerian template of separating sky from earth, the Babylonian template of Tehom as primordial chaos, and it synthesized all of them into a new version, monotheistic, sanitized, but structurally identical. Now we can step back and ask, why did all of these traditions start with the same image? So far, we've traced 4 different creation traditions: Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Canaanite. Different gods, different methods, different narratives, but one universal constant. They all begin with water. Eternal, formless, infinite water. Let's see how consistent this is. In Sumer, the primordial reality was Namu, the cosmic ocean, the mother goddess who existed before heaven and earth, before gods, before differentiation of any kind. The Sumerian word for this was Engur, the underground freshwater ocean that was eternal, boundless, the source from which everything would eventually emerge. In Egypt, it was Nu, sometimes called Nun, the dark, silent, watery abyss that existed before creation. Egyptian texts describe it as infinite depth, neither light nor dark in the way we understand those terms, but pure, undifferentiated potential. The pyramid texts from around 2400 BCE say, "When the sky had not yet come into being, when the earth had not yet come into being, when nothing had yet been built, when nothing had yet been disturbed, when the god had not yet been born, when death had not yet been born, there was only Nu." In Babylon, it was Tiamat and Apsu, the saltwater ocean and freshwater ocean, existing together eternally before gods emerged from their mingling. In Canaan, it was Yam, the sea, the waters that existed before Baal imposed order, before the storm god established his palace, before cosmic structure came into being. And in Genesis, it's Tehom, the deep, the waters over which darkness moved, the formless and void reality that existed before God spoke light into being. This isn't coincidence, it's observation. But why water specifically? Why didn't these civilizations imagine primordial fire, or earth, or pure light? There are practical reasons. Every one of these civilizations emerged in river valleys or coastal regions where water was the dominant natural force. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, destroying and creating in equal measure. The Nile's annual inundation was the source of Egyptian life. When the flood receded, it left behind fertile black soil that made agriculture possible. The Mediterranean Sea defined Canaanite trade and culture. Water was power, chaos. Water was life and death intertwined. So it makes sense that these cultures would project water backward to the beginning of everything. But there's something deeper here. Water has unique properties that make it a perfect symbol for the primordial state. It's formless. It takes the shape of whatever contains it, but has no inherent form of its own. It's undifferentiated. One drop of water is indistinguishable from another. No boundaries, no structures, no categories. It's eternal in motion. Water doesn't stay still unless forced to. It flows, cycles, evaporates, condenses, returns. It's always in process. And most importantly, water exists between states. It can be solid, liquid, or gas depending on conditions. It transforms, but never disappears. It's the perfect image of pure potential, not yet fixed into any particular form, capable of becoming anything. This is what primordial waters represent in these cosmologies. Infinite potential that hasn't yet been actualized into specific forms. The waters don't come into being, they already are. What happens is that they're organized. The Sumerian Enlil doesn't create sky and earth, he separates them. The Egyptian Adam doesn't create the waters, he emerges from them and begins differentiating reality into opposites. Marduk doesn't destroy Tiamat completely, he uses her body to impose order on what was chaotic. Yahweh doesn't create Tehom, he hovers over it and begins speaking boundaries into existence. And this brings us to something crucial. The idea of creatio ex nihilo, creation from absolute nothing, doesn't appear in Genesis 1. It's not in any of the myths we've examined. That doctrine was developed much later, by early Christian theologians trying to make sense of biblical cosmology in philosophical terms. But the ancient texts themselves describe something different. Creation as ordering, not origination. And that raises a question that will become important. If the organizing God didn't create the primordial substance, then where did that substance come from? Or more accurately, has it always existed? And if it's always existed, is it more fundamental than the God who organizes it? We'll return to this. For now, let's look at what Genesis actually borrowed from these earlier traditions, and what it changed. Let's be precise about what we're saying. Genesis didn't plagiarize word for word from earlier myths. What happened was more organic and more profound. The Hebrew scribes, particularly those writing during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, were working within an ancient Near Eastern cosmological framework that had been refined over millennia. They inherited a template. They adapted it for monotheistic theology. They stripped away the polytheistic elements while preserving the underlying structure. Let's trace the specific borrowings. First, the dependent clause opening. Genesis 1:1 in most English Bibles reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." But Hebrew scholars have long noted that this translation may not capture the original syntax. The Hebrew Bereshit can be translated as a dependent clause. When God began to create, or in the beginning of God's creating. This matters because it changes the meaning fundamentally. A dependent clause suggests that verse 1 isn't describing an absolute first act, but rather setting the scene for what follows. And what follows in verse 2 is, "The earth was formless and void, darkness was over Tehom, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Already existing waters. David Carr, professor at Union Theological Seminary, writes that Genesis 1:1 functions as a temporal clause, introducing the conditions that existed when God began organizing creation, not a statement about creating everything from nothing. This matches the Mesopotamian template exactly. The Enuma Elish also opens with a temporal clause, "when on high heaven had not been named." Before Marduk acts, before God's organized reality, the waters already exist. Genesis preserves this structure. Before God speaks, Tehom already exists. Now, at this point, it's important to address something biblical scholars have recognized for over a century, because it directly affects how Genesis should be read. The opening of Genesis does not contain a single unified creation story. It contains two distinct creation accounts, placed back to back. The first runs from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:4a. In this account, creation unfolds through command and separation. Genesis 1 opens like this: "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Genesis 1:1-2. What follows is not the emergence of being from nothing, but a process of separation, structuring, and naming. God speaks, and reality organizes itself. Light is divided from darkness, waters above from waters below, land emerges from sea. Life appears in stages. Humanity is created last, male and female together, as the culmination of an ordered process. The divine name used throughout is Elohim, and the emphasis is cosmic, structured, and procedural. This account concludes at Genesis 2:4a. Then, the narrative resets. The second account describes a different mode of creation. Genesis 2 opens like this: "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up." Genesis 2:4b-5. What follows through Genesis 2:25 is a completely different narrative. The Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, forms a man from dust, breathes life into him, plants a garden, places the man within it, and later creates animals and a woman in response to specific needs. Here, the man appears before plants, animals, and the woman. God walks, speaks, commands, and enforces boundaries. Creation is no longer cosmic and procedural, but local, tactile, and relational. These differences are not subtle, and modern biblical scholarship does not treat them as accidental or stylistic variation. They are understood as distinct traditions preserved side by side. As Richard Elliott Friedman writes in Who Wrote the Bible, the two creation stories differ in vocabulary, style, and conception of God, and they reflect different sources that were combined rather than harmonized. Similarly, Joel Baden, in The Composition of the Pentateuch, states, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 do not represent a single narrative told twice, but two independent accounts with different assumptions about the order of creation and the nature of the deity. This insight lies at the foundation of what is known as the documentary hypothesis, first articulated by Julius Wellhausen, and it holds that Genesis is a compiled text, preserving older priestly and Yahwist traditions rather than rewriting them into a single theological voice. As Mark S. Smith explains, the Hebrew Bible frequently preserves multiple theological perspectives without resolving their tensions, reflecting its long process of composition. In other words, Genesis is layered. And once we acknowledge that the biblical text itself preserves two different modes of creation, the question is no longer whether later theology simplified the story. The question is why these distinctions were collapsed in the first place, and what was lost when they were. Now let's look at the second borrowing, the primordial waters themselves. We've already noted the linguistic connection between Hebrew Tehom and Babylonian Tiamat, but it goes deeper than etymology. In Babylonian myth, Tiamat is the saltwater ocean, chaotic, threatening, associated with disorder. In Genesis, Tehom serves the exact same cosmological function, the formless, chaotic waters that must be organized. The difference is personification. Tiamat is a goddess. Tehom is depersonified. It's just the deep. But the structural role is identical. Ludwig Kohler and Walter Baumgartner, in their authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, confirm that Tehom derives from the same root as Tiamat and represents the primordial waters of chaos. Third, the separation of waters. Genesis 1:6-7. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters that were below the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. This is cosmic architecture, creating a dome, the firmament, to divide the waters vertically. Below the dome, terrestrial waters, seas, rivers, underground springs. Above the dome, celestial waters, the source of rain when the windows of heaven open. This isn't metaphor. Ancient cosmology literally envisioned a solid dome holding back an upper ocean, and this exact structure appears in both Sumerian and Babylonian texts. In Sumer, Enlil separates An, heaven, from Kai, earth, creating the space where life can exist. In Babylon, Marduk splits Tiamat's corpse to create the dome of heaven and the foundation of earth, with waters above and below. Genesis removes the violence, but preserves the architectural function, separation of pre-existing waters to create habitable space. Fourth, creation as speech. And God said, "Let there be light." This is uniquely Egyptian. The Memphite theology describes Ta creating through authoritative utterance. Everything came into being through what the heart thought and the tongue commanded. Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, speaks reality into existence in certain Egyptian texts. Genesis adopts this method, divine command that brings order without physical labor or combat. No battle with sea monsters, just voice. This makes Yahweh more transcendent, more absolutely sovereign, but it's still organization of pre-existing material. Fifth, the creation of humans to serve. Genesis 1:26-28 describes humans created in God's image to rule over creation, to have dominion, to subdue the earth, to manage and cultivate it. This parallels the Mesopotamian tradition exactly. In Atrahasis, humans are created to do the work the gods no longer want to do, to dig canals, maintain fields, offer sacrifices. In Genesis, humans are given stewardship over creation, to work the garden, to name the animals, to manage the earth on God's behalf. The task has been elevated, ennobled. Humans are made in the divine image, not from divine blood and clay. But the functional role remains. Humans exist to maintain cosmic order on behalf of the governing deity. Joseph Blenkinsop summarizes this scholarly consensus plainly. The first chapter of Genesis belongs to the genre of cosmogonic myth widely attested in the ancient Near East. The authors clearly drew on traditional cosmological material, especially from Mesopotamia. This isn't controversial. This is the academic mainstream. Genesis is a late synthesis of much older traditions, rewritten for monotheism, but structurally dependent on its predecessors. And now we can ask the question that connects everything. What does this pattern mean? We've established the historical borrowings. Now we need to interpret what this pattern reveals. Because there's something consistent across every tradition we've examined, something that Genesis would later collapse, but that the older myths preserved more clearly. The distinction between ultimate source and organizing principle that we've been discussing in previous videos. Let's trace it. In Sumer, Namu, the primordial ocean, exists eternally. She's the mother goddess, the substrate from which everything emerges, but she doesn't organize, separate, or impose structure. That's Enlil's function. He divides Anki into heaven and earth. He creates the space where life can exist. He's the active organizer. Namu is ultimate. Enlil is functional. In Egypt, Nu, the primordial waters, is eternal, infinite, the undifferentiated ground of being. But Nu doesn't act. Nu doesn't create forms. That's Atum's role, or Ra's, or Ptah's, depending on which tradition you're reading. The creator deity emerges from Nu and begins differentiating reality into categories, naming things into existence, establishing cosmic order. Nu is source, Atum is organizer. In Babylon, the story becomes more complex because Tiamat is personified as both primordial substrate and active antagonist. But even here, the pattern holds. Before any gods exist, Apsu and Tiamat mingle their waters together. Pure, undifferentiated potential. Only when younger gods emerge and begin creating noise, disturbing the primordial silence, does conflict arise. And Marduk, the storm god, the warrior, the organizing principle, defeats Tiamat and uses her body to build the structures of reality. But he doesn't destroy the substance. He organizes it by imposing boundaries on what was boundless. The waters remain, their form changes. In Canaan, El, the father god, is transcendent, dwelling at the cosmic margins, presiding but not actively governing. Baal is the storm god, the cloud rider, the one who fights Yam, the sea, to establish order, who battles Mot, death, to maintain the seasonal cycle. El is the ultimate authority. Baal is the active power. And when Israelite religion developed, Yahweh absorbed both roles. But the older Hebrew poetry still preserves echoes of the original distinction. Psalms that describe Yahweh defeating sea monsters, crushing Rahab, piercing the fleeing serpent, these reflect the Baal-type warrior deity. But other texts present Yahweh as transcendent, eternal, beyond comprehension, reflecting the El-type father god. Over time, these merged into one figure, but the original pattern was separation, source and organizer as distinct principles. Now, in our previous videos, we explored this in detail. We showed how Yahweh functions as the demiurge, the Greek term meaning craftsman or public worker, the organizing intelligence that shapes reality but doesn't originate the substance it works with. We traced how Gnostic Christians and certain Jewish mystical traditions preserved this distinction: the unknowable, ineffable source, the monad, the one, Ein Sof, and the active creator God who organizes the material realm. And we argued that this is the recognition of a pattern that was always there in the texts, if you knew how to read them. The cosmological myths we've examined tonight prove this pattern is ancient, older than the Bible, older than monotheism, older than Judaism or Christianity. It's the fundamental structure of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, eternal substance organized by a governing deity. Not creation from nothing, but organization of what already exists. And this distinction is crucial for understanding Genesis correctly. When Genesis says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," it's using the Hebrew verb bara, a word that in context means to shape, to organize, to separate, not to create substance from nothing. When Genesis describes God hovering over Tehom, those waters aren't created in that moment. They're already there. He's just imposing structure on pre-existing material. This is organizing demiurgic function, and it's precisely what every earlier tradition described. The innovation of Genesis isn't the cosmological pattern that was inherited. The innovation is theological, insisting that the organizer and the source are one and the same God, that Yahweh is both the eternal ground of being and the active power that structures reality. But philosophically, that creates tensions. If God is absolutely transcendent, how can he be actively engaged in material creation? If God is utterly beyond comprehension, how can he have personal attributes like speaking, commanding, regretting? If God is the infinite source, why does he need to organize pre-existing waters rather than simply willing everything into being from nothing? These are the questions that would drive centuries of theological debate: Jewish, Christian, Gnostic, Islamic. The tension remains in the text if you read carefully. The older pattern shows through. And that brings us to the final question: why does this pattern exist at all? We've traced the Genesis creation origins through 4 ancient civilizations spanning 2,000 years. We've shown that Genesis inherited and adapted this template, and we've identified the core pattern distinction: eternal substance organized by a governing deity. Now we need to ask, why? Why did every ancient Near Eastern culture arrive at essentially the same cosmological structure? Not through copying, but through independent observation of something they all recognized as true about reality. So what were they observing? Let's start with the practical level. Ancient peoples looked at the world and saw constant flux. Seasons changed. Rivers flooded and receded. Storms arose and calmed. Life emerged from death through seeds and birth. Day became night became day. Nothing was permanent except change itself. And yet within all this flux, there were patterns, regularities. The sun rose every morning. The Nile flooded every year. Spring followed winter, and stars traced the same paths across the sky. Chaos constrained by order, flux governed by law. This is the empirical observation. Reality contains both chaos, unpredictable change, potentiality, formlessness, and order, pattern, structure, predictability. And the question becomes, which came first? Did order emerge from chaos, or did chaos emerge from order? Every ancient culture we've examined answered, chaos came first. The waters were the primordial state, and order came later, imposed by divine intelligence. This makes intuitive sense if you think about it phenomenologically. A flood destroys structure and returns land to formless mud. Order requires maintenance. Chaos is what happens when organization stops. A field left unattended returns to wilderness. A building left unmaintained crumbles. A body left without life decays into undifferentiated matter. Entropy is natural. Structure requires work. So cosmologically, they projected this backward. Ultimate reality must be the formless potential from which structure emerges temporarily before dissolving back into formlessness. But there's something deeper here, something metaphysical. These ancient cosmologies weren't just describing physical processes. They were grappling with the fundamental philosophical problem. Why is there something rather than nothing? Or more precisely, why is there structured, differentiated, organized reality rather than pure, undifferentiated potential? And their answer was consistent, because an organizing intelligence acted upon primordial potential to create boundaries, categories, structures. Before that action, there was no heaven and earth as separate things, just Anki, fused together. Before that action, there was no light and darkness as distinct states, just Nu, undifferentiated. Before that action, there was no up and down, no dry land and sea, just Tiamat and Apsu mingling. Differentiation requires an act, a decision, a separation, and that act comes from will, from intentional organizing power. This is why the demiurge concept emerges so naturally from these cosmologies. There must be a principle that chooses to create boundaries where there were none, that names things into categories. This is heaven, that is earth. That says, let the waters be gathered into one place, and thereby creates the distinction between land and sea. That speaks, let there be light, and thereby creates the opposition between light and dark. Without this organizing principle, reality would remain pure potential, infinite, eternal, but undifferentiated. It takes an act of will to say, not this and that together, but this here and that there, not fused, but separate, not chaos, but cosmos, a word that literally means order in Greek. Now here's where it connects back to our previous videos. In Gnostic Christianity, this exact pattern was preserved and interpreted philosophically. The monad, the one, the absolutely transcendent source, doesn't create directly. It emanates, overflows. From its infinite fullness, being emerges like light from the sun. But organization, structure, the material world with all its boundaries, limitations, and dualities? That comes from a lower emanation, the demiurge, the craftsman god who mistakes himself for the ultimate god and creates the material cosmos as a prison for divine sparks. Orthodox Christianity rejected this as heresy. But notice, the cosmological structure is identical to what we find in Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, Canaan, and Genesis. Eternal ground of being plus organizing deity who structures reality from pre-existing substrate. The Gnostics just interpreted it negatively. The material world is a limitation, a constriction, a falling away from the infinite source. Whereas Jewish and Christian orthodoxy interpreted it positively, the material world is good, creation is divine will, organization is blessing not curse, but structurally, same pattern. And that pattern exists because it maps to something real about the relationship between potential and actuality. Pure potential is infinite but formless. Actuality is specific but limited. To make something actual, you must limit the infinite potential. Every act of creation is simultaneously an act of limitation. To create a cup, you must limit clay into a specific form, and in doing so, prevent it from being a bowl or a plate. To create a tree, you must limit cellular potential into the specific form of oak or pine, and in doing so, prevent it from being grass or moss. To create you as an individual, your genetic potential must be limited to specific traits, and in doing so, you become this person and not infinite possible other persons. Organization always means boundary setting, and boundaries always mean limitation of infinite potential into finite actuality. This is the cosmological necessity. Reality as we experience it requires an organizing principle that limits pure potential into structured forms. The ancients called this principle by many names: Enlil, Atum, Marduk, Baal, Yahweh. The Greeks called it the demiurge. The function is consistent, and if you understand this, you understand why the pattern appears everywhere, not through cultural borrowing, but through recognition of metaphysical truth. The distinction between source and organizer isn't arbitrary. It's the necessary relationship between potential and actuality, between chaos and order, between the infinite ground of being and the finite forms that emerge from it. Genesis inherited this understanding from traditions stretching back 2,000 years before it was written, and whether you interpret it positively, as blessing, or negatively, as limitation, the cosmological structure remains the same. Now let's bring this home. So what have we discovered tonight? That Genesis wasn't the first creation story. It was the last in a long line of cosmological traditions spanning 2 millennia. That every major ancient Near Eastern civilization described the same fundamental pattern: eternal waters organized by a governing deity. That the Hebrew scribes inherited this template from Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Canaanite sources, adapting it for monotheism but preserving its essential structure. And that this pattern exists because it describes something real about the relationship between infinite potential and finite actuality. The linguistic evidence is undeniable. Tehom derives from Tiamat. The Hebrew cosmology borrows Mesopotamian cognates, terminology, and structure. The archaeological evidence is conclusive. The myths we've examined are thousands of years older than Genesis, recorded in cuneiform centuries before Hebrew scripture was compiled. The scholarly consensus is clear. Joseph Blenkinsop, David Carr, Mark Smith, and generations of biblical scholars have documented these connections exhaustively. Genesis didn't invent cosmology. It synthesized existing traditions into a monotheistic framework. But here's what makes this so important for understanding our previous videos. Tonight we've come full circle and shown that this pattern is ancient, older than the Bible, older than Judaism, older than monotheism itself. The separation between eternal source and organizing principle wasn't a Gnostic invention. It was the default cosmological structure of the ancient Near East. And Genesis collapsed that distinction, insisting that Yahweh is both infinite source and active organizer, both transcendent ground and engaged creator. But the tension remains in the text. The pattern shows through, preserved in the Hebrew poetry that describes Yahweh battling sea monsters, in the dependent clause of Genesis 1:1, in the linguistic roots connecting Tehom to Tiamat. You can't unsee it once you know what you're looking for. And whether you interpret this theologically as Orthodox believers did, Yahweh is the one true God who creates and governs, or as the Gnostics did, the demiurge is a lower power mistaking itself for the ultimate, or as modern scholars do, Genesis adapted older myths for Israelite monotheism. The cosmological pattern remains consistent: source and organizer. This isn't about faith or doctrine. This is about understanding the texts in their proper historical context, as products of their time, shaped by the traditions that came before them, answering the same questions that humans have always asked. Where did we come from? Why is there structure rather than chaos? The ancient world answered these questions through myth. We answer them through science and philosophy. But the underlying pattern remains as relevant today as it was 4,000 years ago in Sumer. If you found this exploration valuable, go back and watch our previous 2 videos of this creation series. The story we've told tonight is the foundation they build on, the ancient cosmological framework that everything else inherits from. So which ancient tradition surprised you most? Were you aware of these connections before tonight? Let me know in the comments. And if this video challenged or expanded your understanding, give it a like and share it with someone who needs to see it. Until next time, keep questioning.